Uh, Good evening. It's nice to see all of you here. Let me start with a couple of housekeeping issues. I'd invite you all to switch off your mobile phones. And also, our hosts this evening have asked me to let you know that the event is being streamed live. And so their cameras, is it just recorded? Yeah. Oh, okay, that's great. And so at the end of my conversation this evening, we'll have time for questions from the audience. Please do wait for the microphone to reach you, otherwise the folk listening online won't be able to hear you. And we also have books on sale at the end of the event, and both writers would be happy to sign copies of the book. So, housekeeping is over. Hi. My name is Ella Allfrey. I'm Deputy Editor of Granta magazine, and I wanted to start off by thanking the Frontline Club for hosting us here this evening. It's a perfect place for us. This week we're launching issue 122 of Granta magazine, and it's an issue we've themed Betrayal. We have contributions from writers including John Burnside, Mohsin Hamid, Samantha Harvey, and Ben Marcus, and we're introducing two newcomers, Callan Wink and Lauren Wilkinson. It's an issue that explores the nature of betrayal, starting from the premise that without love, there can be no betrayal. The love of a country, of a brother, a spouse, a fellow soldier, or a child. And there's stories here of infidelity, of filial cruelty, and of maternal failure. But this evening, we'll be discussing the betrayal of the citizens of two countries, Sri Lanka and Syria. And I'm delighted to welcome two distinguished foreign correspondents, Janine di Giovanni and Frances Harrison. Let me introduce Janine first. Born in the United States, Janine's first assignment was in the late 1980s, reporting on the Palestinian Intifada. With a focus on the human cost of war, she has worked in many conflict zones, often neglected by the world's press, and won numerous awards for her reporting from Bosnia, Somalia, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, as well as Israel, Egypt, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Chechnya. Janine is the author of several books, including Madness Visible, which is an account of her experiences during the Balkan Wars, a book called The Place at the End of the World, Essays from the Edge, and most recently, Ghost by Daylight, a memoir of war and love. Janine's a regular correspondent contributor to Granta magazine, and she's reported for us from Libya and Bosnia, and in the current issue from Syria. Her essay, 7 Days in Syria, tells of a series of trips she made to the country last year and of the people she met there. I'm also delighted to welcome Frances Harrison. She is the author of Still Counting the Dead, Survivors of Sri Lanka's Hidden War, which was published last autumn by Portobello Books. Frances has worked as a foreign correspondent for the BBC, based in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Iran. From 2000 to 2004, she was the resident BBC correspondent in Sri Lanka and has worked at Amnesty International while writing for her book and as a research fellow at Oxford University. Still Counting the Dead is a harrowing account of the 5 months in 2009 at the end of a decades-long civil war when tens of thousands of Tamils were caught in the crossfire as government forces routed rebel-held areas. It was what the Sri Lankan writer Roma Tern called a dignified, just, and unbearable account in which Frances gives voice to the survivors of a systematic and pitiless attack by their own government. Please join me in welcoming them. Before we move to the readings, I'd like to just start by talking a little bit about the idea of your work as a foreign correspondent. Frances, you've spoken about the accounts in your book as oral histories of the defeated that are gathered together in the hope of sort of getting a different perspective on an issue. And to start us off, I wanted to ask both of you really about this idea of understanding anything, especially as somebody, I know that you were resident in Sri Lanka at the beginning of the idea for this book, but Janine, you often travel to a place and then come out again. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how much you can actually understand as a foreign correspondent and where you even begin. Frances, can you set us off?
Well, obviously in this book it was a particularly difficult task because it was a story that was really cut off to all foreign correspondents or outsiders or aid workers to witness. And that was, I think, the motivation on my part to make sure that surrounded hidden war didn't remain hidden. And I wanted to go back, I wanted to know what it was like to walk through the kind of death march in a way that people went through for 5 months. Of course, I knew some of those people very well, including many who were killed there. And I wanted to know what it was like for them. And I had spoken to them during the course of that war. And to be honest, they hadn't really intimated quite how dreadful it was. So it was quite personal too. I knew those places very well. They were very small areas of Sri Lanka, and I'd been there repeatedly. But of course, you can't possibly know what happened at a time when you weren't there, so you have to piece it together. I watched all the citizen videos. I looked at these horrific pictures of, bits of bodies everywhere. I looked at the maps. I read all the reports at the time, and I met a lot of people who wanted to tell their stories, so did it in excruciating detail over several days. They couldn't stop. It all poured out.
A lot of the people that you speak to are in exile or they're refugees. And I'm interested in the time that you spent in Sri Lanka. Do you think that there's a different way of writing about a place if you've lived there on a day-to-day basis for a period of time? Does it make a big difference?
I mean, it's more personal. You know those people. You know the culture a bit better, perhaps. But obviously, you're still very distant from it. You're doing it quite often in translation. You're doing it at a distance in terms of time in this book. And then anyway, you're trying to tell something that you can't possibly imagine because you didn't go through it. Something that the words don't really capture, the horror of what people went through.
Janine, you've made several trips for the magazine, and I know that your story in this issue is the result of several trips, and you've been back since. And I wonder if you could sort of expand on what Francis was saying about that idea of understanding.
Well, for this story, I actually did 5 trips to Syria, and I think it's a matter of instinct. I mean, I think first of all, you hone your skills at being a storyteller. The writer I was when I was 25 is not the same writer I am 20 years later. And I remember going to Sarajevo for the first time and being so daunted by the history of the Balkans. And I read Rebecca West's Black Lamb, Great Falcon, and I thought, okay, this will give me all I need to know. But it was very intimidating to be in a place where history was unraveling and you could barely keep up with it. And I think as I've gotten older and the more work I've had to do where I'm parachuted into a country very quickly. I mean, I do less of that now because I no longer work for a newspaper, but you learn very quickly where you're going to find your stories. And I'm thinking of Ella and I did a story together in Libya.
I didn't get to go.
During the fall of Gaddafi. And we literally, we didn't know what we were looking for, but I crossed the border, and I was very nervous that I wasn't going to find the right narrative story. And within days, it kind of unraveled, and it was a story about graffiti artists during the time of Gaddafi who were killed for doing it, and in particular, a group of deaf mutes. And it just, sometimes a story comes to you, and it's like a gift, and other times you've really got to search and find it. But I do think, as writers doing narrative nonfiction, in long format, it's something that you develop your voice as time goes on.
And there's, Francis, you spoke about translators, but it seems to me, reading your book, but also knowing Janine's work, that there is an element of a cast that comes together to help you find your story. And who are those people who sort of helped you put this together to the point at which you can be across from someone and have the questions to ask them?
Well, with this, it was quite different from normal foreign reporting in the sense that, normally you go with a team, you'd have a cameraman, a translator, a producer, and all the sort of people with you. But in this case, I couldn't use professional translators because the people I was interviewing were too nervous. They didn't trust somebody else. And I basically had to say, okay, I'll come and interview that person through the intermediary. You provide someone to translate that you trust, because that's the only way it's going to work. And so sometimes they were better than other times. Sometimes it was quite patchy and quite frustrating. It's a bit like touching something through rubber gloves. You don't quite get to the meaning. But it was the only way in which they would countenance it. And the security of many of these people who didn't want to give their names, even now, even in foreign countries, was paramount.
And how did you trust people? It's always a really difficult one. Sorry for jumping in, but
Good question. No.
I know when I interview rape victims, which is this story is about torture, and you have to very methodically go over human rights violations with them over and over again for the details. And do you ever get a feeling when you're interviewing someone that they might be exaggerating or not quite telling the truth or withholding information from you? How do you get past that?
I mean, I've had that in the past. A long time ago, I interviewed somebody who is a Bhutanese refugee, and the translator invented the fact that the woman had been raped. And when I checked the translation, I found that it wasn't true. She hadn't said that. So, it's quite easy. You can get a translator that wants to over-egg the pudding, as it were. Yes, I mean, I think, I've also written about rape and torture. And, I mean, actually, in the torture case I sent, after I'd already interviewed the person, I sent someone from Amnesty to meet the same person. And she also kind of corroborated the details with other cases, and we discussed it. But it is difficult, and you do have to cross-check, and you have to ask questions again and again about what people were wearing and what date it was and the environment. And obviously, if you've done a lot of the interviews about a particular story, you get a sense of what's plausible and what's not.
I'm really interested in the cost of those questions, though, Frances. I mean, your book takes it. Each chapter is told in the voice of a different person. There's a doctor, a mother, the wife of a Tamil tiger, a journalist, and each person is telling a story that's very difficult to read. And I wondered about you sitting across from them, asking them to relive this, and the time that it takes, and how you make it. I don't know how you make it okay for them to be able to do that.
For some of these people, it was the first time they told their story to anyone outside. And some of the things they told me, they hadn't told anyone before. Mm-hmm. And I think for them, the fact that I was an outsider was an advantage, because they didn't have to sit down at the dinner table with me afterwards or see me again the day after. I would just disappear, and that's how they wanted it. They didn't want to be reminded of these quite shameful things. I mean, you're talking about betrayal, too. Betrayal of their whole people, of each other.
There's one woman who says that when she was arrested, she wasn't respectfully treated, and she hasn't told her husband that she was actually raped by the police. That's an
She hadn't told her mother, her sister, her husband. I mean, they knew, because she tried to kill herself twice afterwards, and that's a sort of way of expressing it. But yes, it was bizarre, because her husband was in the background in the house, and we were talking about it, and she hadn't told him about it. And he knew that we were talking about it, so it was very complicated and difficult. But I think all of these people desperately wanted to tell their stories. I mean, they spent days explaining what happened in brutal detail. You couldn't really stop them once they started, although they found it extremely painful. I mean, they had sleepless nights afterwards, because they wanted to rationalize the kind of the survivor's guilt they feel. They wanted to know why they survived, and they assumed it was so they could tell the world what happened. So they wanted to tell.
That idea of bearing witness is really important. At this point, Janine, I'd like to invite you to read to us from 7 Days in Syria.
I'm going to start from the beginning. Hossam. When my son was born, I was unable to cut his nails. It was a visceral rather than a rational reaction. I would pick up the tiny baby scissors, look at his translucent fingers, clean and pink as seashells, and feel as though I would retch. One night, in the hours between darkness and light, the time when the subconscious allows the source of such neuroses to become clear, I understood my inability to perform such a straightforward task. I had a vision of the Iraqi man I once knew who had no fingernails. In the dying days of the Saddam regime, I had an office inside the Ministry of Information. It was a sinister, paranoid place. Journalists begged, bribed, and pleaded to stay inside the country to report. We were followed, videotaped, our phones were tapped. We all knew that our hotel rooms were equipped with hidden cameras. I dressed and undressed in the darkened bathroom. Every Monday morning, the man with no fingernails arrived in my office and stretched out his hands, utterly unself-conscious that in place of nails were raw beds of flesh. He had come for his weekly bakshish, which is a bribe. His job was to get the money to seal my satellite phone so I could not use it unless the ministry listened in. Most of us had to pay our way to get anything done, and aside from the fee the ministry charged, we gave a bakshish to get it done faster. Every time the man arrived, and I looked at his hands spread out, I immediately felt a wave of panic, which turned to nausea, and yet I could not take my eyes off the place where his fingernails had been ripped off. Questions that I could not ask him raced through my mind. What had he done to deserve such agony? Was he an informer? Had he tried to escape Iraq and been caught? Was he part of the secret network attempting to overthrow the dictator? I never asked, nor would he have answered. We were living in a republic of fear. He became one of those shadowy figures one holds in one's mind forever, hovering on the fringes. The man, whose name I never knew, seemed to bear no resentment that he had been disfigured in such a public way. Because hands are one of the first things we usually notice about someone, every time he stretched out his, one knew immediately he had done something. But perhaps he had done nothing at all. Perhaps it was a horrible mistake. Such things happen all the time under dictatorships. People get locked up for years, forgotten. Then the key turns and a jailer says, "You can go now." They never know why. The day Saddam regimes fell, in the feverish chaos, I went to search for the man with no fingernails to open the seal so I could use my satellite phone. But he, like most of the regime's staff, had fled. I went back to Iraq many times after that, but I never saw the man with no fingernails again, except in my dreams. In northern Lebanon, in a town now inhabited by the Free Syrian Army, FSA, and many fighters who are recovering from severe injuries, I do what I do in most war zones. I go to the nearest hospital. In the hallway of a small rehabilitation clinic, I pass a man who recently had 29 bullets removed from his body. Then I meet a paralyzed man strapped to a board who is playing with a child, an orphan child. The man had been badly beaten and left with a fractured spinal cord. Every time he hit me, he said, they screamed, "You want freedom? Okay, take this. Here's your great freedom." Then I meet a man I'm going to call Hossam, a student of human rights law, who sits on a bed trying to re-enter the human race. He is 24 years old and dressed in baggy dark trousers, a t-shirt, and has a full beard and a shy but gentle demeanor. He keeps trying to buy me packs of Winston cigarettes, but I keep refusing, and he keeps insisting, gently, that he must give me a gift. On his hands and arms, I see cigarette burns that I suspect are not self-inflicted. On another bed, pushed against a wall, a 14-year-old boy sits and listens. When I suggest he leaves the room for the interview, which I know is going to be painful, the boy explains that his father was killed in front of him, so he can take whatever is about to come. Hossam is Sunni and religious, but he still shakes my hand and gets off the bed, limping, to get me a chair. He tells me that he comes from an educated family. His father is a civil servant, his brothers all university educated. Then he begins to tell his story without words. Slowly he removes his t-shirt. A thick, angry scar that begins under his mid-breastbone swims down to the proximity of his groin. He sighs, lights a cigarette, and starts to talk in a low voice. Hossam comes from Baba Ammar, the district of Homs, Syria's third largest city, which became an icon for the sufferings of civilians when it got pummeled and overran by Syrian government troops and paramilitary units beginning in December 2011. He admits he was one of the organizers of the first peaceful demonstrations against the government, but denies that he is a member of the FSA. It was about freedom and rights at first, he said. Then came the bullets.
Thank you. Thank you, Janine. In the piece that you've just read from, the people you interview are all worried about how bad things are going to get, and I know that you've since been back. And we see and hear a lot about Syria in the news, but I'm really interested to hear from you, just sort of following on from the piece you wrote from us, what you saw and what you heard.
Well, I've done 5 trips to Syria in the past year, and it's a very difficult place to work, and I am trying to do something which is work on both sides, because I think it's quite, it's very easy to be very starry-eyed about the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, because they're rebels. But the last trip I did a few weeks back was in Aleppo, and it was apocalyptic. I mean, it was very similar to other places I've worked, Sarajevo and Grozny, except that the people weren't just full of despair and lack of hope and hungry and thirsty and injured. They were angry. There was a kind of anger that was, where is our freedom? You know, this is a revolution. We were supposed to overthrow Assad by now, and yet here we are starving. And people had to wait in line for 12 to 14 hours just to get a stack of bread, and sometimes they would get to the top of the queue and there wouldn't be any more bread left. And they rocketed, the government had rocketed the hospital, the main hospital, and basically nurses and doctors were killed. And if you rocket a hospital, you very clearly are taking aim at civilians. So for me, there was this great sense of a war, another war that's going to be long, protracted, and very bloody. In some ways, it reminds me of the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, but in other ways, every war is a different template. And I just, when I'm on the other side, in Damascus and Homs and areas that are government patrolled, you've got to be very careful. You know, you've got to be, it's a very paranoid place like the Saddam regime. But you've also, as a reporter, you have to work with a very open mind. I mean, I'm by no means a regime supporter, but you have to go and talk to soldiers of the regime, and you realize very quickly that, you know, most soldiers don't want to be where they are. You know, they're forced to do it. They don't like war. They're young. I remember going to talk to this one guy in a government hospital, and I talked to him for an hour before I said, "What is your injury?" And he pulled off the sheet, and he had lost his left leg and his left arm. And he was 22 or 23, and his mother was there, and it just suddenly you realize that, you know, the real horror of war isn't about diplomacy or even dictators. It really comes down to the human suffering, and that's what, I mean, Francis and I think, tried to do, is to try to tell the story of the bigger picture of war and geopolitics through people's stories, people's suffering.
You start off gathering facts, and you write very well about, you know, your starting point going to a hospital, because you know that there'll be stories there. But in the crafting of your piece, I mean, this piece starts off with you describing your son as a baby. It's very personal, and it becomes very much about stories. And there's clearly a value in all of us knowing what's going on, and that bearing witness that we all talk about. Do you think it makes any difference? Do you think that the way that you tell those stories makes any difference at all?
I hope so. I mean, I was just at Davos, and I met the head of the Islamic Red Crescent, who was saying to me there's no humanitarian corridor in Mali, so there's no aid getting to people. The only way it's coming is through the Niger River. And he said to me, please, I'll help you get there. You know, the only weapon we have is you guys, you reporters that can write about it and somehow affect policy. I think it's kind of arrogant to think that we do have any effect on policy, but often we're the only ones there. You know, I know Francis, what she was saying earlier about, you know, there was no aid organizations, I've been in places when Grozny fell, for instance, where there was no Médecins Sans Frontières, no UN, no other journalists, and you're witnessing extraordinary atrocities and human rights violations, and you just think, my God, I've got to get this story out to the world before I'm killed or shot or my satellite phone goes down. And I think, without being too self-important, I mean, we have to give a voice to people that don't have voices. That's our role.
I think, you know, you tell people what happened, whether they take action as a result, whether they're motivated to do something, is not really your job. They can't say they didn't know.
I was deeply affected by the chapter in your book, the journalist Loki-san, who, this is a young journalist who works for the Tamil, not the
pro-tiger media,
the
really.
pro-tiger media, thank you. And he, throughout all kinds of hardship, is still taking pictures, still sending reports. But at one point, he says that if Reuters or the BBC had been there, then surely all of this would have stopped by now. And I wondered if you thought he was right. Would that have made a difference?
I think it would have made a huge difference.
Maybe give a little bit of background for the audience today.
Well, as I said, this was an area where the UN evacuated, where they pulled out. It was completely closed off. And in a way, it was a war that people didn't find out about because, unlike Syria, there was no outpouring of refugees over national borders because it's an island. There was a corner of an island. So people simply couldn't escape. They just moved and moved further towards the sea and ended up on a narrow spit of coastal land, hundreds of thousands of people of about 14 square kilometres in length. So, you know, he took photographs, he took videos, and they weren't used because they were so graphic and he didn't know what to do. So he started sending them in black and white because he thought maybe people could, you know, take that. And he understood that, you know, the reality was too horrific. And I think, you know, he believed that if international media had been based there, the impact would have been different, that he simply wasn't trusted because he was Tamil. And that was to a large extent true. And I think had BBC or CNN or Al Jazeera been broadcasting live from that area, I think the world's attention would have been seized by it much sooner. And yes, the outcome might have been different.
Francis, would you like to read to us from your book now?
So I'm going to read a portion from the beginning of the chapter about the doctor in Sri Lanka. It was in the lobby of an empty hotel on a windswept, rainy Atlantic coast that I'd arranged to meet the Tamil doctor. A political refugee from the tropical jungles of northern Sri Lanka, he now lives in a tranquil landscape of pine trees and glaciers. Wrapped in a thick fleece against the damp chill outside, the doctor was extremely nervous about delving back into the past. He'd just been through a month of intensive trauma counselling. There were times when he'd contemplated suicide. On several occasions during our interview, he had to break off to visit the bathroom and wash his face, to control the emotions he was reliving. 2 years on, the doctor still recounted the war through traumatized flashbacks, the anecdotes exploding in random order in his memory, zigzagging back and forth across the months. He rushed to describe each one quickly before it faded again. Often, he seemed to be actually back in the war zone, seeing the scenes of horror flash in front of him, constantly pulling himself back into the present. These snapshots were punctuated by apologetic, high-pitched laughter. Short, dark and balding, with big eyes peering watchfully from behind a prominent nose, you wouldn't know he was a hero. He looked like an ordinary 47-year-old man, even a little plump, a far cry from the emaciated figure who escaped at the end of the war. Though he had many opportunities to flee, he chose to stay till the end in order to save lives, believing he himself would not survive. Pieces of shrapnel narrowly missed him as he operated in makeshift field hospitals. He's convinced they were deliberately attacked, even though he repeatedly gave the Sri Lankan government details of their positions so they'd be spared. He calculates that his team of doctors, nurses and medics saved at least 20,000 people, but he's tormented by 150 patients he abandoned under a tree on the very last day of the war. He wants to forget the hands clawing at his sarong, the voices asking to be rescued as he tore himself away and ran through a hail of bullets to surrender to the Sri Lankan army. Now in exile, living in safety with his wife and 3 daughters on icy, unfamiliar shores, he's still fearful for his extended family back in Sri Lanka. Call me Neeron. I have to be careful. Any problem caused by me, and they'll take revenge, he says, referring to the Sri Lankan authorities. Recently, one friend told me the police came with my photograph and showed it to him, asking if he'd seen me. That was after I'd left. They were looking for me, but it was too late. At first, they were searching for the Tiger leaders. We were the second priority. Now they realize our importance as witnesses. He was one of just a few government doctors who stayed on throughout the war to serve their people. Even though the northern jungles had been under rebel administration for years, such was the power of the government bureaucracy that it still deployed doctors and civil servants in these areas. Increasingly desperate on rare occasions, the doctors spoke out about the carnage in telephone interviews with the international media. At the end of the war, the other doctors were captured and forced by the Sri Lankan government to retract everything they'd said. Neeron was the one who slipped through the net. At first, Dr. Neeron worked in proper hospitals, the patients lying on clean sheets in beds, tended by nurses in starched white uniforms. Soon he was setting up makeshift operating theatres in public buildings, homes, tents, and then finally in the open under a tree. By the end, many of the nurses were dead, and the doctors were amputating limbs without anaesthetic, using butcher's knives. Neeron spent 6 months working around the clock, taking short naps sitting upright in a chair between operations. The last time he had a good night's sleep in a bed was in December 2008. In early January 2009, he was busy at work when he received a message that his own wife had been injured. In the middle of the night, he rushed to a nearby clinic to discover she'd been unconscious for 9 hours with a head injury and fractured arm. Their youngest daughter was by her side, but unhurt. His wife, a teacher, had been speeding on her motorbike in a panic to reach her children during a shell attack and had crashed into an auto rickshaw at a junction. Their other girls, aged 8 and 10, were left alone at home, wondering what had happened. They only stopped crying when their father eventually appeared, but even that night he didn't sleep at home, quickly returning to his hospital to be on duty. Mrs. Neeron regained consciousness but developed epilepsy. Without the right drugs, it was impossible to control. The terrified children wanted their father. Dr. Neeron felt torn in 2 directions. His patients needed him, so did his family. With one arm in a sling, it was difficult for Mrs. Neeron to climb in and out of the bunkers. A few weeks later, she fell on her fracture again. Dr. Neeron decided to evacuate his family on a Red Cross ship, taking the injured out of the war zone. There was no question in his mind but that he must remain. For the next 4 months, he had no news of his wife and children and no way of contacting them. After a while, he tried not to think of them. He simply assumed they were going to die. Now sitting in an armchair opposite me, Dr. Neeron abruptly recalls the horrific image of a charred body left on the road outside his hospital. A blackened corpse sat in the driver's seat of a wrecked tractor, his hands stuck to the steering wheel. For a week, all the traffic just went round the tractor as if it was a perfectly normal obstruction. Passers-by were impervious to the sight of death. I can't describe that situation because it was an entirely different world, a place of inhumanity, he says. I lived there, but now I'm afraid to go to such a place as that. Towards the end of January 2009, the attacks intensified, the puddles running red with blood. Inside the improvised hospital, desperate mothers found their wounded babies with their bare hands in a pathetic attempt to ease their suffering. People would arrive with all the flesh blown off their limbs, the white bones visible like chewed joints of raw human meat. On the afternoon of January the 26th, Dr. Neeron emerged from hours of surgery, exhausted and spattered with blood. He had a quick chat with a nurse whose job it was to inspect the incoming patients. The 23-year-old woman had just discovered her own brother among the injured in the admissions tent that morning. After 36 hours on duty, she asked Dr. Neeron for a rest. A few minutes later, she walked into the yard to take a break, just as a shell landed. She was killed right in front of the doctor, who'd been the last person to speak to her.
Thank you. You're writing in this chapter about a doctor who is working for the government, as it were, and just thinking about what Janine had said earlier about the difficulties of trying to see both sides, and this sometimes, I guess, mistakenly romantic appeal of a rebel army that when we're reading about it in the papers. What really struck me was your constant efforts to balance a portion of responsibility for the war and for the atrocities committed. And I imagine that must have been really difficult because you were speaking exclusively almost to Tamils during this period of great suffering. And I wondered how you managed that. Was it something that you had to come back to and go through the book and try and make sure it was balanced?
Well, it's something I struggled with a lot because, I wasn't sure whether they were telling me everything. I had to talk to lots of different people. And I think, one of the most shocking interviews was the nun, actually, who I talked to, who was Tamil, but who had struggled very intensely with these moral questions of right and wrong, and had almost kind of crashed in terms of her faith in God as a result, and was still, really distressed. And she was very, very honest about the things that the rebels had done to their own people to increase their suffering, and had struggled to come to terms with that. And actually her interview over 2 days was mostly conducted in a whisper, because it was almost as if the things she was recounting were so horrific she couldn't say them in a proper voice. So I found some of the people I met, particularly the Catholic clergy who were witness to the war, they had struggled a lot to come to terms with the moral issues on both sides and apportion blame.
Yes.
But yes, it was really important, obviously, to be balanced.
Janine, as you're both reading, I find myself exhausted by the stories, and certainly reading them at any length. And even though you know that these are people's lives and it's important, it's wearing and makes for very difficult reading. You keep going back. What is the compulsion?
I just had this conversation with a friend before I came here, and it's what I am, and it's what I think, I'm very fortunate to know that what I do well and what I don't do well. And I think that I can go to these places and people can talk to me, and I think they feel they can trust me, and I can bring back their stories. But I think it does take its toll on you. I mean, in Aleppo, I was in the hospital, and a baby died in front of me, and he was 15 days old, and I couldn't help it, but I just started, I knew I shouldn't have, but as the doctor was working on him and kept working on him even after he was dead, trying to bring him back to life, and then finally the way he folded the blanket over this tiny body, I started crying. And I was with two very young reporters, and they just kind of looked at me, and, and I couldn't stop the tears coming down my face. I mean, it was really embarrassing, but I went home and I thought, well, I'm glad I can still feel that, because I think in some ways you have to be detached, but I've never been able to master that. And even 20 years ago in Sarajevo, I mean, people became a part of my life and a part of the fabric of my being. So I think one of the things we're often accused of as reporters is being vultures. We kind of go, we enter people's lives, we get their stories, and then we leave. And I'm very conscious of the fact that, we're going there as Western reporters, that we have cash, that we're able to leave places like Aleppo or Sri Lanka or Chechnya, and we have that freedom and ability to get out and go home to our stable lives. And there's a great sense of guilt that goes along with that. It's not you really leaving people behind, and that you're going and they're staying. And so I think we, as storytellers, we take a lot away with us.
Francis, I know that you are still collecting stories about Sri Lanka and about this time, so that compulsion is still there. It doesn't feel as if you wrote the book, it's now done.
I think it would be better for me if I finished, but I can't really let go of it, because there are still things that, because once you're out in public, having written a book like this, people come to you too. And you understand the intricacies of the stories, so you know where to spot something that's new. But yeah, I mean, there are still things that I don't know the extent of, even after writing this book. So, I mean, there's a particular incident where there's some very senior Tiger leaders who surrender, who then found dead, and various witnesses are coming forward who say that they saw them alive, and then obviously their dead bodies were found later. Or there are more and more stories about sexual abuse that are only now really emerging, because the stigma around it for Tamil women is huge, and it takes a long time for those people to get out of Sri Lanka. Often they go to India, then they wait and they come to the UK, and they have to file their asylum cases, and then it's through some of the lawyers that you find out gruesome, horrific stories of gang rape and murder of their family members too. And I'm hearing more and more of those now, so I'm only beginning to get a kind of sense of how bad that was, for example. And this is now, nearly 4 years after the end of the war.
Janine, just before we open up to the audience, I'm interested in that response you had to the doctor and the baby. I think it was last week that the American government was talking about allowing women on the front line, and there was debate about it. And whenever we send you off somewhere, I'm sitting at my desk worrying, I wonder about women and mothers as reporters. Do you think that the fact of being a woman makes you a different kind of reporter?
I mean, I'm always asked this question, and I don't think so. I mean, I think it's your makeup. I mean, I know men that are highly sensitive and would feel it in the same way. And things have changed a lot since I started out, and it was a very, very macho profession, and women, weren't really welcome in the kind of boys' club. And I think now, there's more and more women doing this job in television, in radio, in print. I think what changed me is being a mother. I mean, I became a mother very, very late in life. I never thought miracle for me. And that's what I can't help but when I see children die or women who are raped, identifying or torture. If you read on in this piece, this man, Hossam, was beyond any kind of torture I've ever heard in 20 years, I mean, horrifically tortured. You feel it because, I just think he could be my son, he could be, and you have to, in some way, have to protect yourself. Otherwise, we'd go mad, I think.
No, I agree completely.
Yes.
I mean, I had a very young baby when I first went to Sri Lanka in 2000. It was 2-3 months when I went there. And I spent my days, hearing horrific stories of torture to extract confessions and so on. And it was quite different as a mother because you understand in a different way, more instinctively, the love and the investment that goes into bringing up a child anywhere.
And not being able to protect them.
Yeah.
The inability of parents in war zones that unable to feed your children, unable to get them clean water, unable to protect them from shelling or rocketing. I mean, that to me would be my biggest horror. It's one thing to protect yourself, it's another thing to protect your offspring.
It's interesting because one of the images that stuck in my mind from the book was that search for baby milk powder. A lot of people talk about it, and it seems a small thing, but all the things that have to collapse for you not to be able to find milk powder are all
not to be able to produce breast milk
not
because you're so starved,
Yes.
basically, and not to be able to get milk for your children was unbelievable. So these conversations between mothers and children, where the children would say things like, "Mummy, will you ever feed us potatoes again? Will we ever eat proper food again?" Because they lived for months off kind of watered down rice, basically. And to see that through the eyes of children, one of the mothers in the book, her child is the same age as mine, and when I went to interview her in London, they had all the sort of 11 plus, books that you have on verbal and non-verbal reasoning who've been through all this. And I saw all these Bond assessment books on her bookshelf, and her English was very basic, and I thought, my God, you've just come out of this war zone. Your children, your 9-year-old lost half her body weight in 5 months. She was so starved, and you're pushing them through this exam. I was sort of awed, actually, that they could do that. It's incredibly brave as a mother.
I think this is a good point to open it out to the audience. If anyone has questions for Janine or Francis, and Saskia has 2 microphones at the back, so if you wave at me, she'll come and find you. There's a lady in the front in the pink jersey. I should have said fuchsia. Sorry.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Mira Salva. I'm a reporter. I was Africa correspondent for The Independent. I just wanted to ask the question you touched about bias, Francis, about bias. You mentioned Lokasan, who was saying the things he reported weren't trusted because he was Tamil. And I've always wondered about this because I've reported on parts of the world where I'm not from, and I only very recently started writing on Sri Lanka, and I find it very hard to know whether to even attempt to be objective because I'm from Jaffna. I was born there. I left when the war broke out. So do I even pretend to be objective the way I would be in the rest of my reporting, or do I put myself out there and say, I'm Tamil and this is what I'm writing, and does that then completely negate anything I say? I just think it's interesting that in some ways you leave yourself open to the accusation. You ask I wanted to ask what makes a war a tipping point, because Sri Lanka's war conflict has carried on since 1983, but it's very rarely been reported. And yet at the same time, the diaspora has been very active and had huge protests in Westminster. And you get a sense that sometimes it's not a war till somebody, white or Western, comes and tells the world it's a war. And is that completely fair?
But of course it's not fair.
No.
Obviously not. But I mean, even, okay, I've written a book, Channel 4 made documentaries about it, Gordon Weiss has written a book, as you know, but still it's not really been given the attention that it merits, however you look at it. I mean, if you look at the sheer intensity of suffering, if you look at the scale of killing, we now know maybe up to 70,000 people killed in 5 months. That's pretty mega by any standards of any war in this century, and yet you know, more people died in Moldaviko than in Srebrenica, and who's ever heard of that place? So it is a real struggle for anybody, whether you're white or you're Tamil, to get people to listen to this story of what happened in Sri Lanka. It's just not on the map.
But
So I struggle
it's
too.
not on the map.
Well, I mean, there are all sorts of reasons, but you know, strategically not important, misinformation from the government side, you know, a lot of reasons. As I mentioned, refugees not coming out with their stories. There are a whole range of reasons why people are not interested in it. But you know, to be honest, I've done what I can to try and make them more interested in it. But it is a huge uphill struggle, and you know, I don't see why you, as a Tamil who know the country and speak the language, shouldn't have a voice to speak about it too. I mean, they accused him of being biased, Lokisen, because he was operating in a Tamil tiger-controlled area where it was very difficult to criticise the tigers, and he didn't. But when the things he did report were pretty accurate as far as I can see.
That's a great question, thank you. Anyone else? Yes, there's a lady on the same row as you, Saskia.
Thanks very much. My name's Margie Buchanan-Smith. I'm a researcher, do a lot of work in Darfur. And I was curious about I was wondering what you do with the stories that you hear that you aren't able to publish or report. Because I'm sure there are lots of stories that you hear that you can't cover. And of course, particularly when people have taken a risk, or it's been really important to them that you have borne witness to that story, is what you then do with that. And I think, Francis, you have worked for Amnesty. I'm just wondering if there are other channels that you're able to use.
Well, we write books. I mean, do you mean because it's too graphic a story and that we can't publish it, or is it we just don't have space in our reports?
I'm more thinking, I mean, I'm also kind of aware of that myself as a researcher. You've got more material that you can use, but some of them are very personal stories.
I don't think anything ever gets wasted. I mean, that's of my view. You know, your notebooks are there, and at some point you come back to those stories. I mean, I can't really think. The only period of my life that was incredibly frustrating is when I worked for the Sunday Times during the Bosnian War, and even though, you know, it was being covered more than Sri Lanka or the DRC, I had this huge frustration because it was a weekly paper. I had one shot a week to get a story in, and my editor was more interested in Princess Diana than in Sarajevo. So, but I kept all those notebooks. I had all those notebooks, and you can do longer format things. There's just not as great a market for it anymore, which is another source of deep frustration for us. I think people want short, sharp bangs of news, and that's why we have 24-hour, you know, BBC, Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya. They don't want to take the time and read an 8,000-word piece, which in fact is, you know, what we try to craft. But I don't think anything ever gets wasted. I think later in your career, at some point, you use it in a different way.
Francis, at the beginning of the book, you write about those people who gave you their time, whose stories you didn't tell. Just very briefly, you're saying there was this person and so on. So you've experienced that as well, that they were stories that didn't make it into the book.
Yes, and some were edited out by the publisher because they thought it was too much. I mean, some of the ones that I wrote as full-length chapters, I'm going to publish elsewhere because I think they still have, you know, validity in, you know, magazines and so on. I think, you know, some of the characters I met who were unable really to tell their story in sufficient length that I could use it as a full chapter. Some of those people are still valuable. You refer to them in articles, or you refer them to, you know, war crimes lawyers, human rights organizations, depending on what the issues are around them. And sometimes you just have to leave it alone because they're not safe. You simply can't use it till they come to safety, so you have to wait. It's a long waiting game. I mean, I know of several really good stories. I can't touch them yet till I know those people are safe.
But it's a long-term thing as well.
Yeah.
You know, you can see it in the long term and not just a sort of initial reaction to something. But
Janine, you said something that I find quite disturbing. You said that there isn't a market for it. And I know that this is true. I know that what you're saying is true. But that means that these stories of real suffering that should be important to all of us then have to become a commodity, I guess. Does that affect the way that you are able to write the story if you're having to think of that market?
it's very difficult now. I mean, and also journalism is so fickle. I mean, Mali's having its 10 minutes of fame right now, and you know, then it was Syria, and But there's places in the world that are just not covered at all, and it's hugely frustrating. There's about 3 outlets now for long format journalism, which is Granta, The New Yorker, and Vanity Fair. And we're being overrun. Journalism is, I hate to say this, is a dying industry. We're being overrun by bloggers and by celebrity journalism. There's less and less what Granta does, which is reportage, which is a very purist form, I think, of journalism. I don't think we can let ourselves get discouraged. I think we have to. I just feel that we kind of stumble from project to project, and we try to get funding. There are outlets. The Nation helped fund these 5 trips as well as Granta. And I think that we have, if you believe something, your passion for it has to overtake your frustration,
Your good sense.
which can be
Do
huge.
you share that frustration, Frances? Is it something you feel too?
Yes, I share it about journalism generally, and I share
Yes.
it about this particular story, so both of them, yes.
Another question from the audience. Yes, there's a young someone at the back wearing black. Sorry, I haven't got my glasses on. Young someone.
Young someone.
I'm curious about you, both of you. You've been in a place with a different kind of living and dying, really. And I think you described it as an entirely different world, a place of extreme inhumanity. And I wonder, having been there and experienced that, how it feels to be here now in this way.
Frances, should we start with you?
Obviously, I wasn't actually in it. I was, looking at it afterwards. But yes, when I did the interviews, it was pretty horrific, and it was quite dislocating in a sense to come back to the real world and to deal with your children's concerns about what's for dinner or why it isn't this thing or that thing. It does reorient your priorities. You do think differently about what's important, and you do think to yourself, why on earth am I upset about this? These people went through life and death. They're lucky to be alive. So, yes, it changes you to hear these sort of stories.
Janine, does there have to be a limit to how much you allow it to change you?
I think that you have levels of fear, too. I think I'm much more frightened now of my own mortality than I was 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And it sounds very crude, but in Aleppo, I was unbearably uncomfortable. It was so cold. And I have a friend here who covered Sarajevo with me, and in those, we had no electricity or heat then, but 20 years younger, you can kind of do it. I think I don't want to be injured. I don't want to be killed. And I think that it does change you. One thing, where did you go? There you are. One thing that is the most important to me is that I feel grateful all the time. I feel grateful that I've lived and worked in Africa for a long time, and water is so precious to me. And water, healthcare, I don't take anything for granted, and I feel like that is a huge gift that I have from working in war zones. And living through genocides and seeing bodies piled up. I never take for granted what I have. And I think that, in a way, I feel privileged to have been a part of that. And another friend of mine once said that he felt about Sarajevo, if humanity was going to destroy itself, then I felt privileged to be there, to be able to witness it. And I just feel so grateful for everything I have. I never take it for granted.
We have time for a couple of more questions. There's a lady in the front, Saskia. 2 ladies in the front.
Are you able to tell us, regarding Syria, how graffiti on a wall that was done by children has led to whole cities being bombed to rubble?
I'll try.
Can you give us some background so we all know?
Sure. That she is referring to the start of the Syrian revolution, which was children. Again, we were talking about graffiti artists before, writing graffiti, who were then tortured and killed. And what started as a peaceful revolution quickly spiraled into an armed revolution. I think that you have 2 kinds of revolutions. Either you follow Gandhi and Martin Luther King's principles, or the guru of it is Gene Sharp, who's a professor in Boston. You either have peaceful revolutions where you absolutely condemn any use of weapons. And that's what the Syrian revolution started out as. And then in Homs, it kind of split off with people who believe we are only going to get our freedom with guns. It's now spiraled into a civil war, a sectarian conflict. And I think what happens is violence begets violence. So, and there's also vengeance. Your family is killed, you're uprooted, you're ethnically cleansed. You then seek revenge. So it's this terrible cycle of violence that keeps going and going. I mean, why did Tunisia, well, the people were killed there, but Tunisia managed to get through it very quickly because there was a very firm commitment that it was going to be more of a peaceful revolution than an armed conflict. And unfortunately, Syria has descended into a very brutal conflict that I think will go on for a long time.
There's another question here.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you both about aftermaths. What is the aftermaths of all of these horrific situations and these conflicts? Because often we talk now, there's this word post-conflict, right? But I'm a researcher also. I've worked on Bosnia and on Spain, and I mean, Spain is still kind of post-conflict, even though the conflict ended in 1939. I mean, of course, there's the dictatorship as well, which is another form of the conflict. But what have you seen, what have you learned about these post-conflicts, about Sarajevo today, about Bosnia today, about Sri Lanka? What it will look like 20 years from now, even if the violence doesn't spark off again in the form of a hot war?
Excellent question. Francis, would you like to start off?
Well, people talk a lot about transitional justice and, post-conflict, and there isn't really any transition in Sri Lanka because the same people who are the victors are in power, and it's a triumphalist, sort of victorious, chauvinist state that has all the power, and there's no at least the rebels, when they're brutal as they were to their own people too, they were a balancing power. They offset what the government did. So now I think what you see is the sort of violence that was meted out to Tamils continues with no restraint, but also increasingly is meted out to Sinhalese, the majority community, and other minorities, Muslims in Sri Lanka too. So it's turned inward. Any opponent of the government now is under pressure. And so I think what you see is definitely a worsening of the situation in terms of civil liberties in the south of the island as well as in the conflict area. And in the conflict area, it's not over. It's simply not over because people say they don't know how many dead bodies there are. They don't know if their family members are alive or dead, if they're in secret detention camps, they're disappeared. They want some closure. And this is nearly 4 years later. And the kind of abuse, disappearance, it continues. So in no sense is it really finished. And I'm not sure that you can really go through something where tens and tens of thousands of people are killed in the most brutal way, and you just say, okay, well, it's finished now, let's move on, let's forget the past, and let's all live together. I don't think you can do that without some kind of truth-telling process, and that hasn't happened at all. I mean, you can't even mourn the dead. That's how bad it is.
But some countries, I think, do recover at a faster pace than others. I think there is this terrible legacy of hatred, and it takes generations to process. But Bosnia, I think, will take a very long time because there is this kind of vengeance, and it's just, I go back there a lot, and it just, to me, it's this kind of simmering resentment, and also because the way the war ended, it basically froze front lines. So the perpetrators were rewarded in a sense. But Rwanda is an interesting case because the genocide in 1994 killed 1 million people in 4 months. And there has been a transition there like South Africa. And I think it has to do with the truth and reconciliation, that people kind of process it. And it therefore it'll be less time than I think Bosnia, which will take generations and generations to kind of heal these scars, these wounds.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes, the gentleman in the front. Here we go.
Just a question to both of you about publishing. We've seen the last issue of Newsweek. Some may or may not lament that, but on the other hand, it seems to have given a new lease of life to the Daily Beast, and I'm just wondering, is that where publishing is heading? That and blogs are such a bad thing, and do we really need to look at ways of course, getting funding out of blogs? Is that the future?
I I don't read blogs. I have to admit, I'm one of the, you know, I live in France, and I still go out and buy the newspaper every day. So I'm a complete dinosaur when it comes. I don't read newspapers on my iPad. And you know, I feel, you know, the Newsweek is a tragedy, I think, for journalism, because again, what we were saying, there's less and less outlets. It is still online, Newsweek, rather than the Daily Beast, but I do think this is a big issue about blogging, because if you work in the Middle East, what really frightens me is people use Twitter now instead of AP and Reuters as a source of information. And you know, journalists working in Cairo just sort of go through Twitter. Ah, there's a demonstration there. And they take it as fact. This is very frightening to me, because blogging, there's no watchdog. You can write whatever you want. Whereas, you know, having worked for a wire service and newspapers, I know, you know, the fact-checking and working for Ella, you know, the fact-checking that goes into it, and the revision and you know, that is journalism. That's part of the process. But when you get a blogger who can put anything,
you know, okay, citizen journalism, blogging, it's all, you know, it's another source in a way of information and misinformation, but you still need quality journalism. You need the professional checks, you need the expertise, you need the funding to send people like Janine to go and look at both, you know, Damascus and Aleppo. You know, you need to have people who have that skill, who can do that. And you know, I don't think you can compare journalism, say, in the New York Times with a blog or Twitter. It's just not the same thing. And I think increasingly what you see in broadcasting, which is where I've worked, is a reliance on news agencies, on AFP, Reuters, and so on. And you know, they almost don't think that anything's happened unless it's on two agencies. But that doesn't encourage investigative reporting. It doesn't encourage going to the spot to actually see something and to dig and to find something for yourself that's new and different. And there needs to be more of that, because that's how you find new things.
And they use photographs of, you know, citizen journalism on CNN of on-the-spot witnessing that. It's just very worrying, I find. And the Huffington Post, for instance, doesn't pay people. So it means that, you know, you're not being... It's not a métier anymore. It's a sort of, anyone could be a journalist, anyone could be a photographer, anyone could be a filmmaker. Everyone's filming with their iPhone now and sending it into CNN. There's no lines drawn, and I think this really is a grave. I mean, we really have to address this as reporters and as editors. It's something very serious that could irrevocably damage our profession.
On that note, thank you all. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. We have copies of Frances and Janine's book and copies of Granta magazine for sale. But most of all, I'd like to thank Frances and Janine very much for brilliant conversation. Thank you both.
Thank you, Ella.